morning, everybody. Good to see you again. I'd like to invite you to turn in your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 5. We're going to be reading verses 12 to 15 today. It's Deuteronomy chapter 5. And as you're turning there, I'd like to ask you to ponder the question in relation to last week's challenge. Where do you feel resistance to practicing restfulness? Where do you feel resistance to practicing restfulness? So, a little bit of context if you weren't here last week. Last week we wrapped up our series on Judges, and I won't be able to summarize how we got there, but the call to action that came from that sermon was to practice the Sabbath, to actually take a 24-hour period every week to stop, to rest, to delight in God, and to worship Him. And so maybe this is the day that you've decided to put that sermon into action. Maybe you have a different day of the week that you do that. Maybe you weren't able to do it this week at all. But then the question is, what is the point of resistance that's keeping you from entering into that restfulness? I think this kind of resistance is something that we're going to face regardless of where we are, whether we're seasoned Sabbath practicers or maybe you're a Sabbath newbie like me, or you've just never tried it at all. I think just the culture that we live in, maybe just the human condition, is that we're going to be facing resistance internally and externally to entering into this Sabbath rest. A little story from last week as I'm preparing a message on trying to keep the Sabbath as an application. Saturday is usually the day that works for me to practice the Sabbath, but all Saturday long, even though I knew I was going into preaching a sermon about how we need to keep the Sabbath, I was feeling this really strong resistance against keeping the Sabbath because I was like, I have a sermon to prepare and I could be better. It's not quite ready yet. And so all day long, I'm feeling this resistance of like, there's more work to do. I could keep working on this sermon. I could keep refining it. But I had to tell myself, okay, but it's a sermon on keeping the Sabbath. So like, come on, man, give it a rest. But maybe that's something that you can resonate with. There's a lot of different potential sources of resistance. Maybe you just have an oversized workload and activity. You taking on too much between school and work, or things that the kids have going on outside of school and work. Maybe there's just too much on your plate. You've made too many commitments and you need to try to cut back on some things, but it's hard to say no. Maybe you've just got poor planning, procrastination, distraction. Like I know a lot of the time when I was in university, I wasn't practicing the Sabbath on Sundays. And I'd like to say, oh, it's just because I was way too busy. But in reality, like all those hours between classes where instead of doing my readings, I was just watching a video on YouTube or walking around the halls aimlessly. Those probably added up to about 24 hours in a week that I could have practiced the Sabbath, or I could have been a little bit more focused when I was doing my readings and getting distracted all the time. Sometimes that's the problem, right? Is it's not that we don't have 24 hours to rest, but we're not very good at working the other 6 days and we get distracted. Maybe we just don't know what rest looks like. Maybe we kind of live in this cultural moment where in Jesus' time they had way too many rules about the Sabbath, but we just don't have any rules about the Sabbath. I don't even know what it means to practice the Sabbath, so how would I do that? And that's kind of the resistance that I'm feeling. Whatever it is, I think all of us can agree that we're going to feel some kind of resistance to entering into restfulness. But I hope that we all think that God knew what He was doing when He designed this 6 days of work, 1 day of rest rhythm, and that there's actually life for us if we're going to enter into that. And so today we're going to look at one of the 2 instances of the 10 Commandments in the Bible where God commands the people of Israel to keep the Sabbath day holy, unpack a little bit what that looks like. Before we get there and actually read it, just a little bit of context about Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is the Greek name of this 5th book of the Bible. It comes from the words deutero and nomos, means second law. So if you're wondering, why are the 10 Commandments in the Bible twice? Why are we reading this commandment to keep the Sabbath holy twice? We're reading the second law, the context being this is the second generation of Israelites after being freed from slavery in Egypt. And they're right here on the edge of the wilderness, about to enter into the land that God promised to Abraham and his descendants. And they're being given this kind of pep talk by Moses, a reiteration of the covenant that their ancestors made with God at Mount Sinai 40 years ago, as they're about to enter into this land to be that holy nation and that kingdom of priests that are going to be a display of God's wisdom and justice to the nations. They're kind of remembering, what is it that we're committing to before we enter into the land? So that's the context as we're reading this. And so starting up in verse 12 of chapter 5. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male servant or your female servant, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is with you in your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And so one of the interesting things about this version of the Ten Commandments is that if you compare the one in Exodus to the one here in Deuteronomy, pretty much everything's the same, except that God gives a different reason for them to practice the Sabbath here. In Exodus, he said, you should practice the Sabbath because when I made the world, I worked for 6 days and then I rested on the seventh. Here he says, it's because you ought to remember that I redeemed you from slavery in Egypt. So we'll unpack that a little bit more. But I think the main question that I want to ask today to kind of frame this sermon is, what does it mean to observe the Sabbath by keeping it holy? I think there's a little bit of ambiguity maybe about what work and rest actually are. Sometimes it's like, is doing the dishes restful? Like, I don't know, I'm not going to be super rested if the house is a mess, but it also kind of feels like work to do the dishes. It can be easy to kind of get legalistic about these things and not feel a little bit paralyzed, like, what do I do? What's work? What's rest? I don't know how to practice the Sabbath. And then maybe you get into these super legalistic places like the Pharisees in Jesus' time, where it's like, there's only a certain amount that I can walk in the day or something before it becomes work. It can be a little bit confusing. Sometimes for us, we then react in our culture with a little bit of like a very lax approach. We're like, I'm not even going to try to practice the Sabbath at all, or I just have a really, really feeble understanding of what that means. I think a good example of this, I was listening to the Bible Project's podcast on seventh-day rest in preparation for this sermon, and John, one of the hosts, talks about this time where he was at a restaurant, and up on the wall they had posted the 10 cowboy commandments. And so it's the 10 commandments in cowboy speak. And so it's like, honor your ma and pa, no fooling around with another feller's gal. But the one for the Sabbath is, get yourself to a Sunday meeting. So it's an interesting reflection, right, of what does it mean to practice the Sabbath? Well, in cowboy culture at least, it means go to church on Sunday, but that's about it, right? So we kind of are left like, what does it actually mean to practice the Sabbath? We don't necessarily know. And so today I'm just going to walk through this passage following with 4 movements of what it could mean to practice the Sabbath that I've found really helpful from going through a course on practicing the Sabbath recently with my small group from Practicing the Way. If you want to learn more about the Sabbath, do it with your life group. A little recommendation, but we're going to look at the Sabbath in 4 movements of stop, rest, delight, and worship. And so this is my best attempt to kind of summarize what I've been learning about the Sabbath over the last few months. So movement number 1 is stop. So we see in the text that God says to observe the Sabbath day. And we can stop right there. What does Sabbath mean? This is our first hint at what it means to practice the Sabbath. In the Hebrew, the word here that's translated, or transliterated oddly to Sabbath is Shabbat. And it literally, like its most basic meaning is just to cease, to stop. That's how it's most often translated when it's a verb in the Bible, is just to stop and to cease. And so the idea here is just that you're stopping from doing any of your work. All the regular things that you're doing as part of your day-to-day routine to kind of keep yourself alive, to sustain yourself. It's a way of just stopping doing those things. And as we kind of examined last week, this is kind of an inconvenience to stop all of these things that we're doing to sort of keep ourselves alive, but it's sort of supposed to be an inconvenience. The idea is that when we stop doing all of these things and inconvenience ourselves, we're recognizing in an embodied way that actually my existence doesn't depend on my own effort and my own work and my own striving, but I'm stopping to recognize that it's actually God who's sustaining me and that he's in control and that my time belongs to him, not to me. And so I'm stopping from pretending as if that's not the case, which I have a tendency to often do throughout the other 6 days. And so, ultimately I think Sabbath is really about trust. I think a great illustration of this is the Israelites in the wilderness in Exodus 16:22-30. There's this whole story about how God, he gives them manna to eat in the wilderness. And he tells them, like, you can collect it for 6 days, but on the 6th day, collect enough for 2 days, and then don't go out and collect it on the 7th day. But then there's still some of those Israelites who are like, I don't know if I trust God. I'm going to go out and collect it on the 7th day. And they go do it anyways. And so I think we have a similar kind of challenge ahead of us with practicing the Sabbath. Is like, am I going to go collect my manna for a 7th day, or am I going to rest, to trust that God is actually the one who provides my daily bread, so to speak? And so just 3 points on what maybe we need to stop from, some general guidelines. This is obviously not exhaustive, but just some ideas of what it might look like to stop on the Sabbath day. Obviously, we stop from working. So we're relinquishing this illusion of security and control that we might have from other sources, like that accumulation and accomplishment are going to be what get me through life and not God. And so we stop from doing like our paid work, but also, the other things that we do to kind of sustain our existence, those housework things, the chores, all that sort of stuff. We're stopping from doing all of those sorts of things. We're stopping from worrying. This is a day, I think, to release our anxieties and, give over our trust to God. And obviously, like, stop from worrying. It's like, don't think about white elephants or whatever. But the idea being, we're trying to be intentional about when we find ourselves worrying. I'm just going to stop. Like, today, tomorrow can worry about itself. Like, today, I'm just going to choose to cast my anxieties on God. I'm going to stop worrying about the future, and I'm just going to take this day to rest in the Lord. We're going to stop from wanting as well. I think in our culture especially, we have this kind of insatiable consumer mindset of like, I want more. I always want more. I'm never satisfied with what I have. I can't do what God said and say 6 days, that's good. No, I'm just going to rest here in the 7th day. It's like, I just got to keep accumulating more and more. So I think a great practice on Sabbath could be to stop buying or stop engaging in activities that maybe are exposing you to that kind of consumer mindset of, I'm seeing a ton of advertisements and stuff that are sort of stoking in me that desire to want more, to continue wanting. So stop from working, stop from worrying, and stopping from wanting. Easier said than done, but the idea is that practicing the Sabbath over a long period of time, we're slowly going to start to transform ourselves into the people that, not just on the Sabbath day, but in our whole lives, can stop from toiling through life on our own effort, can stop from worrying and learn to trust God, can stop from wanting and learn to be satisfied in God and who he is and the good things that he's gifted us with. Second movement of Sabbath that we're going to look at is to rest. And so again, we're going to look at that Hebrew word Sabbath or Shabbat. Another way to translate this is rest. And so it doesn't just mean cease, but say in Genesis 2, when God finishes up creation, it says that he rested on the 7th day. That's that same word, Shabbat. So he stopped or he rested on the 7th day. And so again, the question being, what does rest mean? In the context of our passage, we have the people of Israel coming out of a country, a system, a regime where rest just wasn't an option for them, right? They were slaves, and you read, especially Exodus 5, it's like Pharaoh is sort of typifying, he's representative of like the taskmaster that just is relentless. Like, you never stop working. He says all these things like, we're going to make them work harder. They're going to have to collect their own straw. They're just lazy. Like, more work. And what is he having them work on? Like, working to build these store cities to store all the stuff he has, I guess. And so for the Israelites, rest was a liberation from slavery, right? I don't have to work for Pharaoh anymore. I can actually, I'm under the lordship of a God, of a king who allows me to just stop from that striving and to actually rest in him. And so our question of what does rest mean for us today, I think we need to remember that we are whole persons. We're body and we're spirit. We're in spirited flesh in the language of in the anthropology of the Hebrew Bible maybe, but one way that we need to rest is just body rest. I think, many people in our culture just suffer from kind of a chronic, constant, low-grade exhaustion. There's like a lack of sleep that plagues us. I think before Edison and the invention of the light bulb, like the average like sleep time was 10 to 11 hours a night, and now we're at like 6 to 7. So like we're actually just physically tired, and like our prefrontal cortex can't engage at its highest level because we're just like physically too tired. We probably just need more sleep. So it's a day to get some of that body rest, to actually just sit down or lay down, take a nap, catch up on some sleep if you need to, sleep in. It's also a day for mental rest, to slow down just from that breakneck, hurried pace at which we're always processing everything, right? Like we are just fed information so quickly all the time. It's a day to start to kind of slow down, to maybe dig deep into something instead of just skimming across the surface of everything, to stop that constant flow, to just take a moment to be quiet, to let your mind come to quiet and come to rest. And it's also a time for spiritual rest. It's a time to, make that space to be still and to like rest in and be with God. Like I think, we often aren't even like alive to our souls and alive to God because everything's just happening so fast. We're so bombarded with distractions all the time that like the rest that our souls and our spirits need is sometimes to just like power off those digital devices, to stop all the distraction and all the noise, and like actually let ourselves become aware of God and like our deepest self again. Maybe we haven't in a long time, right? It's a time to be intentional about that in the week. Movement number 3, delight. And so looking at the text here, we see, again, like the context here is that the generation previous to this generation who's receiving the 10 Commandments is that their parents were slaves in Egypt. Like they didn't have any time or chance to delight in God, right? Like they were under a hard taskmaster and they didn't get to enjoy the gifts of creation. They've been liberated now by God to enjoy God, to enjoy the good things of his world. And I think we are called to do something similar in our Sabbath rest, is to actually cultivate a mindset of gratitude towards God, of recognizing the goodness of the world and actually taking the time to slow down and to delight in the world. And so I think, we see this kind of a failure in this regard on Israel's part. If you read through the Exodus, through Numbers story, there's this recurring motif and pattern of the Israelites are like grumbling all the time. And they're like, we wish we could go back to Egypt. And they kind of forget like how bad things were back then. And they don't cultivate this delight in God and this gratitude for and remembrance of what he's done and just how awesome their new lives are that they've been liberated into, and in anticipation of what's to come in the land where they're going to receive as an inheritance from God. And so I think I've got a quote there from John Mark Comer. He makes this excellent point that the Sabbath is a way of retraining our mind to delight in the good and the beautiful and the true. Like we live in a world that is kind of just shoving like the ugliness of reality in our face all the time and down our throats. Like you turn on the news and it's just like, here's all the bad things that are happening in the world. Like how brutal and ugly is the world. And, your social media feed is like designed to like feed you outrage and anger because that's what gets clicks, right? And so like we're constantly kind of living in this world where maybe we're even just surrounded by people who have a bleak outlook. And we actually need to retrain our minds to focus on what's good and noble and true and upright, because that's not necessarily what we're seeing in the world all around us. And it's not about being ignorant to the fact that there's suffering and evil in the world, but it's about having a balanced view of seeing that there is a God who's good and who's at work. And so question being like, what can we delight in? So again, not an exhaustive list, but just kind of 3 ideas of what we might delight in on the Sabbath, be intentional about refocusing and retraining our minds to delight in. So we can delight in God's good world. It's a time to enjoy the good things that God's gifted us with here in life, right? Like having community to share a meal with, enjoying good food, enjoying music or nature, or whatever it is that kind of brings you to a place of delight in God. Those great things in creation, right? Like we sang this morning, all things are from God and all things are to God. Like recognizing that everything in creation is a gift from God and that it's all meant to come back to him. And like what can I delight in and see as a good gift from God, and not just take for granted, but actually receive as a gift and take time to delight in, right? Like, we live in a world where we have so much, and it's so easy to not delight in the little things and to just take them for granted. But like, I remember talking to my great Oma about how when she was a kid, they would get an orange for Christmas, and that was like, just blew her mind. It was out of this world. What a great gift. And I'm like, an orange? Like, that's a terrible gift, right? But like, that's kind of symptomatic of our culture, right? Like, we have so much that we just take everything for granted, and everything just kind of becomes like, eh. But like, take the time to actually slow down and be like, wow, like, this food's awesome. Like, savor it, enjoy it, actually delight in it. To delight in God's good image bearers, to actually take the time again to do the same with the people around you again, not to take for granted the wonderful people that God's put in your life, but to actually take some time to, get out of your little digital world or whatever and like look face to face at the people who are around you and talk to them and actually enjoy them and see them as gifts from God in your life and get to know them and see all the beautiful things that God's doing in them. And then to delight in God himself. Again, like, what are those kinds of activities that you can do that actually start to center you on God and bring you to delighting in him, that start to turn your heart towards gratitude to God. Like, for myself, like, there's certain things that I can do that just distract me from God. Like, if I'm, I don't know, watching hockey or something, it's not ever really necessarily bringing my mind towards God. It's just making me angry that the Leafs lost again. Like, right? But when I go like on a hike or something, or I'm reading a great book of fiction, or I'm making music, like all of these things, I'm actually finding, man, when I'm out in nature, like just seeing the beauty of it all and slowing down, like this is actually making me think about God and actually enjoy him and enjoy his world. So what are those things that will help you to actually think about God and to delight in him, to be thankful for him, to enjoy him in his presence, to become aware of his presence all around us, to become present to him? Richard Foster, sort of a spiritual formation guru, has this great quote, though, about how this celebration or delight or joy is a discipline. He says, celebration is a discipline. It's not something that falls on our head. It's the result of a consciously chosen way of thinking and living. And so, we want to be people of celebration in our whole lives, not just one day of the week, but Sabbath is a day to stop the things that we're normally doing, to be intentional about, okay, I'm going to train myself to be a person of celebration, a person of delight, a person of gratitude, who's noticing the goodness of life and calling it out and displaying it to the world. So that's the movement of delight. Final movement we're going to look at is worship. This is kind of the culmination, like what it's all about. Like Sabbath, it's a great day to stop, to rest, to enjoy the good things of God's world, but ultimately it's all about worship, right? And our passage, it says that we're to keep the Sabbath holy and that it's a Sabbath unto the Lord. And so, as Deb did a wonderful job of explaining, holiness, sometimes we confuse that with like righteousness or some kind of other moral word, but really holiness at its base is just an idea of being set apart. Like utensils were a perfect illustration because in the Torah, there are holy utensils, like they're utensils that are special, that are set apart for use in the tabernacle. And so the idea here is that we have a day that's set apart from the other days for a special purpose. And in particular, in the Bible, holiness is about being set apart for God's special purposes, right? And so the idea here is that we have a day that's set apart for God. It's a Sabbath unto the Lord, that it's not just a day for me to be like, great, I'm on vacation, it's all about me, but it's a day that's ultimately bringing us towards worship of God. And so, again, we're going to do three little things of what worship might look like. What could we worship God for? So number one is just that we worship God for what was. So, we remember what God has done and we worship him for it. That, we take the time, for the Israelites, this was like, remember that God liberated you from Egypt. For us, this is like, remember what happened on the cross, right? Remember when God liberated us from Egypt, that the same God who raised Israel from Egypt is the same God who raised Jesus from the dead and us from the dead in Jesus. That we can celebrate that and worship God for that. we can worship God for what is. Like, how do we see that Sabbath rest breaking into the world now? How do we see the kingdom of God breaking in the world today, here and now? The resurrection life being, signaled to and foretasted here in the present, that I can, worship God for those things. And then as well, worshiping God for what will be. There's a really interesting thing that happens in Genesis 2, which we've talked a little bit about today, where there's a pattern in Genesis 1 that's set up where it says there was evening and there was morning, the blank day. And that pattern gets broken at the end of Genesis, or I guess the beginning of Genesis 2. I don't know why they put the chapter break there, because it doesn't make any sense. Genesis 2, 1 through 3, the ending of Genesis 1, it breaks the pattern. There is no evening and morning the seventh day. And a lot of scholars have posited the reason for this is because it's setting up this idea of kind of the ultimate goal or telos of creation is that it's a seventh day rest that never ends. Like, God set it all up, and it's like, now he's just resting in the temple, and this is kind of the way it's supposed to be. And all that is to say, there's this motif that goes throughout the whole Bible of like the seventh day rest that never ends. Like, Jesus is bringing us back into that rest, that we're slowly kind of working back towards this new creation where we can rest with God once again, where God will rest in all his creation. And so we're worshiping God for what will be. We're taking time to anticipate, to look forward to this ultimate rest that is to come, to savor it, to continue to motivate ourselves to like lay down our lives in worship as a living sacrifice towards the end of partnering with God and bringing this about. And so, like when I say worship, I don't just mean singing songs. Like, obviously that can be an expression of worship, but this idea of worship as like our whole life, right? Like, it's a way of saying, God, you're worth everything I have. I'm going to center my life on you. I'm going to, make my life a sacrifice to you. And so, this is what I'm talking about when I say worship, but taking time to really make this a day that's about God, to take time to, not just stop from our work, not just to take a nap and to enjoy some good food and some good company, but ultimately to be worshiping God, to turn us into people of worship throughout the whole week. I've got this extended quote from Leslie Newbegin that kind of explains this different idea of freedom that we have in the West compared to the biblical idea of freedom. He says, seen from a biblical perspective, a human being is not and can never be autonomous. Consequently, liberation in the Bible is always seen as a change of regime or jurisdiction, from the false domination to the true, from serving Pharaoh to serving Yahweh, from serving death to serving God. From the point of view of the Enlightenment, the biblical idea of freedom is paradoxical, a freedom of the same, it's hard for me to read from back here, sorry, freedom of the one who serves the true master. From the point of view of the Bible, the freedom celebrated in the Enlightenment is the freedom offered by the serpent in Eden, the freedom to make one's own decisions about what is good. By accepting that offer, we put ourselves under the domination of the powers that lead to destruction. We become, as Paul says, the slaves of sin. So the idea here being, right, in this passage in Deuteronomy 5, celebrating the Sabbath is a way of remembering that we have freedom from Pharaoh. But freedom from Pharaoh in the biblical imagination isn't like, great, I'm free from Pharaoh, now I get to govern my own life, like I'm in charge. Like, no, that's kind of the whole thing that happened in the garden that got us into this mess in the first place, right? Like, the reality is that when we try to run our own lives, we just become slaves to our desires. We will always end up worshiping something. And so whether that's Pharaoh and his regime and the gods of Egypt of accomplishment and accumulation or something else, when we don't live as we were created to live for God, then we're ultimately just going to become slaves of something. And so it's like true freedom is when we live as servants of God, and that's how we're going to experience it. So that's why this like worship element, it's not just like God's this egotistical God. He's like, I need you to sing praises to me or something. It's like, this is actually what we were designed for, is to live these lives of worship. And that's what's going to bring us fulfillment ultimately in our lives. That's what's going to bring us like to ultimate rest. And so, application for today, lots of information that I'm throwing at you. information is not going to produce transformation. And like at Forest View, our vision here is that you'd live out your full potential in Christ, that you'd be conformed into the image of God over time. And so like we want to see transformation happening all the time. And so putting this into practice is what's going to ultimately bring that kind of transformation. It's going to make us start to look like those people who are living out something close to their fullest potential in Christ, at least. And so Augustine has this great quote. He says that we were made for God, he says, you have made us for yourself, Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. And I think maybe when we reflect on our lives, the world around us, like we can see that restlessness. Like we're trying to find rest and security in so many other things than God. But ultimately, we're only going to find rest when it's a rest that's in God. Like that's what our hearts are yearning for. That's what we really desire deep down on the deepest level. And so, as we're chasing after these other things, like we see the fruit of our kind of ceaseless restlessness in our culture, experiencing burnout and fatigue and stress and poor immune systems and frayed relationships and brain fog and just like a felt sense of distance from God. Like I'm not even aware of his presence at all. I'm just always distracted. And so putting something into practice that's going to start to stand against resting in other things and is going to help us to rest in God, practicing the Sabbath is really important. And it begs the question of what is important to me, right? Like, what am I trying to get out of life? Am I just living by accident and kind of going through the motions of life and going with the flow? Or am I living with intentionality and purpose? Am I like too busy to live a spiritually rich life? Or does that maybe signal to me that my priorities are out of whack, that the things that I'm focusing my attention and my time on, like if I'm too busy or have too many better things going on than being able to practice the Sabbath, then it's like, where have my priorities gone, kind of, right? And so, my encouragement today, if you weren't here last week, the application was just, if you don't already practice the Sabbath, or if you do, to sort of just encourage you to continue going on, to continue strong, to set aside a time period, a 24-hour time period. Preferably, if you can't start there, start where you can, but 24 hours to practice the Sabbath. Take some of what we learned today and apply it. And I think, we spend a lot of time in the Judges series talking about the Judges cycle. I think there's a similar kind of cycle, a little bit different, that goes on in our culture when it comes to kind of chronic restlessness. I have this quote from Michael Zigarelli. He says, it may be the case that one, Christians are assimilating to a culture of busyness, hurry, and overload, which leads to two, God becoming more marginalized in Christians' lives, which leads to three, a deteriorating relationship with God, which leads to four, Christians becoming even more vulnerable to adopting secular assumptions about how to live, which leads to five, more conformity to a culture of busyness, hurry, and overload. And then the cycle begins again. So my encouragement to you today is just to break that cycle, to begin to implement this practice and other practices into your life as well, but starting here with a practice of like not adding more, but just doing less, to start breaking this cycle of assimilating to our culture of busyness and hurry and overload. That's ultimately, just not good for us, right? Like this kind of hurried, busy living doesn't make us Christ-like, I don't think. Like, I don't find that when I'm in a huge rush or I'm really tired that I'm well-equipped to be a person of love, that those are like my best moments. Like, usually those are my worst moments where I'm doing things that I'm not proud of and I have to confess later, right? When I'm like stressed and tired and busy and I haven't taken any time to rest. It's not conducive to me living out God's mission in the world, to be a witness in life and word and deed of the goodness of the gospel and of the way of Jesus. And so, this is really important, like not just for ourselves, that I don't want to be experiencing this kind of burnout and restlessness in my life because it's sort of tearing me apart, but also for the sake of the world, that like we talked about last week, like if we're going to be a contrast community in our culture that stands out as doing life in a way that's God-directed and different and is actually attractive and appealing to the world and invites them to ask questions about like, why do you practice the Sabbath? Like, how are you so rested and non-anxious and not stressed? Like, we need to do this for the sake of the world as well, I guess is the point. And so, yeah, we need some concrete steps and some habits to try to produce this transformation that we need to undergo as individuals and as a church as well. And so I'm just not trying to pile more on, so I'm just going to reiterate last week's application point. Maybe you haven't even had a chance to put that into practice yet, but we've just got 3 points of application. So number 1 is just to set aside a time to practice the Sabbath. So to pick a time that preferably every week, if you can keep it consistent. It has to change week to week, but be intentional about planning. Like, this is the 24 hours that I'm going to practice the Sabbath this week. And then sort of like the optional second thing from last week was to pick a beginning and ending ritual just to mark out that time. So maybe you want to read a psalm or light a candle or have a meal or go on a walk or something that's going to kind of mark, like, I'm starting the Sabbath, and then the same thing at the end, that like it's ending today. And then in the blue, I just have like another optional thing that might be helpful to you. I've found it helpful, is sort of based on the principles that we talked about today of stop, rest, delight, and worship, to make a list of things that you will do on the Sabbath and things that you won't do on the Sabbath. So for me, the things that I try not to do on the Sabbath include, like, I just won't use my digital devices. Like, I'm going to power off my phone, power off my laptop, because those things just speed me up. They just distract me. They just hurry me. So those are things I'm not going to do on the Sabbath. Things I will do on the Sabbath, I've tried to kind of think about, like, what are some of those things that help me to rest, that help me to delight in God, that help me, like, index me towards worshiping God. So, like, I will try to get out in nature and go on a hike. I will read a good book that, helps to stoke hope and joy and peace in my heart. I will take some time to make some music and to image God and creativity. List is going to look very different for everyone. Like, for you, reading might be like, that's work. I hate reading. For me, it's not. But make your own kind of list, right? So that's a potential exercise for you. But yeah, these are 3 points of application. But yeah, I'd really just urge you to really take this to heart, to put this into practice, to not just walk away from the sermon and go, okay, next week's application, we'll brush them all aside, but start to put this into practice. And finally, I just want to meditate a little bit on how the gospel informs the way that we go about this. Like, the slavery that the people of Israel were under in Egypt is analogous to our own slavery to sin and death, right? Like, that motif in the Bible of the road out of slavery through the waters of death and into this new creation life. Like, that motif is all over the Gospels. Like, that's what Jesus is doing on the cross, is he is creating a new exodus for us to have freedom from our bondage to sin and to death, and to be liberated into a new life. And so, like, ultimately, the rest that we have and can experience on the Sabbath comes from what God has already done. Like, the fact that we don't need to strive for more. Like, we don't have to live under the tyranny of death, of like, I have a finite amount of time to live and I need to squeeze every last drop of enjoyment out of life while I've still got it, because, like, death has been defeated and I have hope in a resurrection life of so much more beyond that. I can actually, like, live sacrificially, and I can, like, give it up to God and trust him with my life. And so that's hard to do. Like, where we started, like, there's going to be resistance, but taking the time to really meditate on the goodness of the gospel, to let that, like, soak into our bones, that we actually can live lives of rest, and at least one day of rest, is just super important, I think. And so, yeah, that's my challenge and my encouragement to you, to be, like, freed by the reality of the gospel, that Jesus has defeated sin and death, and you don't need to live under their tyranny anymore. I'm just going to close us in prayer. Yeah, dear God, we face so much resistance to entering into the Sabbath rest that you have on offer for us. Like Jesus says in Matthew 11, that we can come to you when we're weary and burdened and experience rest for our souls, for our whole being, God. We want to enter into that, God. We don't want to be living under the tyranny of Pharaoh, but to fully embrace and accept in our lives your lordship, your kingship, and the rest and the goodness that comes with that. And so, God, pray that you would help us all to continue to practice Sabbath, to begin to practice Sabbath, whatever it looks like for us, God, so that we can begin to be a community of people who display a better way of life to the world. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.